November 24, 1971. A quiet man walked through an airport terminal with a briefcase in his hand. 30 minutes later, he calmly told a flight attendant that he had a bomb. He demanded $200,000 in cash, 4 parachutes, and a fuel truck waiting on the runway. Hours later, somewhere over the forests of the Pacific Northwest, he stepped out of the back of a passenger jet, into darkness, into a storm, and vanished. For more than 40 years, investigators searched for him. They never found a body. They never recovered the money. And the name he used to buy the ticket was never real. The world remembers him by another name. D.B. Cooper. November 24, 1971. The day before Thanksgiving in the United States. Airports across the country were crowded with travelers heading home for the holiday. At Portland International Airport in Oregon, the afternoon moved like any other. Passengers lined up at ticket counters. Families carried luggage through busy terminals. Business travelers checked their watches, hoping to catch the next flight. Among them was a man in a dark suit. He approached the counter of Northwest Orient Airlines. He purchased a one-way ticket, Portland to Seattle. The cost was $20. He paid in cash. The name written on the ticket, Dan Cooper. He carried only a briefcase and a paper bag. Nothing about him drew attention. He appeared calm, well-dressed, quiet. Just another passenger boarding a short flight north. But within an hour, that quiet man would turn an ordinary airline trip into one of the most famous mysteries in criminal history. Northwest Orient Flight 305 was a Boeing 727, a short regional flight with only 36 passengers on board. The aircraft lifted off from Portland shortly after 2:50 in the afternoon. The flight to Seattle would take less than 30 minutes. The man who called himself Dan Cooper sat in seat 18C, near the rear of the plane. He ordered a drink, bourbon and soda. He lit a cigarette. In 1971, smoking was still permitted on commercial flights. The cabin filled with the quiet sounds of conversation and the hum of the engines. Then Cooper reached into his pocket and removed a folded piece of paper. He handed it to a flight attendant named Florence Schaffner. She assumed it was a phone number. It happened often. Passengers sometimes passed notes to flight attendants during flights. Without looking at it, she slipped the paper into her purse. Cooper leaned slightly toward her. His voice was calm. "You should read that note." Something in his tone made her pause. She opened the paper. The message was short, clear. "I have a bomb in my briefcase." Schaffner looked up. Cooper gestured to the seat beside him. "Sit down." She sat. He opened the briefcase. Inside she saw red cylinders, wires, and a battery. The device looked convincing. Then Cooper began explaining exactly what he wanted. There was no panic in his voice, no raised tone, no sudden movement. Cooper spoke quietly, almost casually. But every word was precise. He wanted $200,000. In cash. $20 bills. He also demanded 4 parachutes. 2 main chutes. 2 reserve chutes. And he wanted a fuel truck waiting when the plane landed in Seattle. The instructions were written clearly on another piece of paper. At the bottom of the note were the words, "No funny business." Florence Schaffner carried the message to the cockpit. The pilots read it in silence. Within minutes, airline officials on the ground were alerted. Then federal authorities were contacted. The Federal Bureau of Investigation quickly became involved. This was no ordinary threat. It was a skyjacking. And in the early 1970s, airplane hijackings were happening with unsettling frequency. But this one was different. The hijacker had not demanded political asylum. He had not asked to be flown to another country immediately. Instead, he wanted money, parachutes, and time. The plane was instructed to circle the Seattle area while authorities prepared the ransom. Inside the cabin, the passengers remained unaware. They continued chatting, reading magazines, looking out the windows at the cloudy skies. Meanwhile, only a few rows away, a man calmly held an entire aircraft hostage. As Flight 305 circled above Seattle, Negotiations began on the ground. Officials faced a difficult decision. Should they stall, attempt a trick, or give the hijacker what he wanted? The Federal Bureau of Investigation made a calculated choice. They would comply. The priority was the safety of the passengers. Banks across Seattle were contacted. $200,000 was assembled in $20 bills. Every single bill was photographed. Each serial number carefully recorded. If the money ever appeared again, investigators would know. Meanwhile, inside the aircraft, Cooper remained composed. He smoked cigarettes, drank another bourbon, spoke politely with the flight attendants. Witnesses later described him as calm and controlled. There were no signs of panic, no frantic movements. He seemed patient, almost relaxed. Hours passed as the plane continued circling. Below them, authorities rushed to gather the ransom and the parachutes. Finally, just before evening, everything was ready. The pilots received instructions to land. Flight 305 began its descent into Seattle. The aircraft touched down at Seattle-Tacoma Airport shortly after 5:30 p.m. Police vehicles surrounded the runway, but they remained at a distance. Following Cooper's instructions, airport workers approached the plane slowly. The ransom money was delivered first. 2 heavy bags filled with $20 bills. Then came the parachutes. 4 in total. Exactly as he requested. Cooper inspected them. Satisfied. Then he did something unexpected. He released the passengers. All 36 people were allowed to leave the aircraft safely. For them, the terrifying situation ended without violence. But Cooper was not finished. He kept 4 crew members on board. The pilot, the co-pilot, the flight engineer, and 1 flight attendant. Then he gave new instructions. The plane would take off again. Destination: Mexico City. But the flight would require a refueling stop, and the aircraft would need to fly under very specific conditions. Conditions that puzzled investigators. At first, at 7:40 p.m., the Boeing 727 lifted off from Seattle once again. This time with only 5 people on board. 4 crew members, and the hijacker. Cooper handed the pilots a list of instructions. Fly at 10,000 feet. Maintain a slow airspeed. Keep the landing gear partially lowered. And keep the wing flaps extended. These unusual instructions forced the aircraft to fly slowly and steadily. But there was another reason. The Boeing 727 had a feature unlike most commercial aircraft: a rear stairway beneath the tail. It could be lowered during flight. Investigators would later realize something important. Cooper knew about that stairway, which suggested preparation. Perhaps research. Maybe even aviation knowledge. The crew remained in the cockpit. Cooper stayed in the rear of the aircraft. Alone. With the money. With the parachutes. And with the open night sky waiting outside. The aircraft flew south through heavy clouds. Rain fell across the forests below. The crew could not see what Cooper was doing in the cabin. But they heard movement. At one point he asked the flight attendant to join the cockpit. He wanted to be alone. Minutes later, a warning light illuminated inside the cockpit. It indicated the rear stairway had been lowered. Cold air rushed into the cabin. The pilots felt the aircraft shift slightly. Then, at 8:13 p.m., something changed. The tail of the plane jerked upward. A sudden movement. Brief, but noticeable. Investigators would later believe that moment marked the exact second Cooper jumped. Somewhere over the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. With $200,000 strapped to his body. And a parachute on his back. Below him stretched miles of forest. Rivers. Mountains. And darkness. The plane continued flying toward Reno, Nevada. The crew had no way to know whether Cooper was still on board. When the aircraft finally landed, authorities rushed inside. The rear stairway was open. Wind whipped through the empty cabin. 2 parachutes remained behind. But Cooper was gone. He had vanished into the night. Within hours, the Federal Bureau of Investigation launched an enormous search. Military aircraft scanned the region. Ground teams entered dense forests. Helicopters flew low over rivers and valleys. Investigators searched for days, then weeks. But they found nothing. No parachute. No equipment. No body. No money. It was as if the hijacker had simply disappeared. As investigators reconstructed the crime, strange details emerged. Cooper seemed to know aircraft terminology. He understood flight speeds. He knew the Boeing 727 had a rear stairway. Some investigators believed he might have been a trained parachutist, perhaps a military veteran, possibly a cargo loader or airline employee, someone familiar with aircraft design. But other experts raised doubts. The conditions that night were extremely harsh. Heavy rain, freezing temperatures, powerful winds, and thick forests covering the ground below. Experienced skydivers later examined the situation. Many believed the jump would have been extremely dangerous. Some concluded survival was unlikely, which raised a chilling possibility. Maybe Cooper never escaped the wilderness at all. For nearly a decade, the case remained unsolved. Then in 1980, something unexpected happened. A young boy named Brian Ingram was playing along the banks of the Columbia River near Vancouver, Washington. While digging in the sand, he uncovered something strange. Bundles of decaying cash. Rubber bands still holding the bills together. Authorities examined the serial numbers. They matched the ransom money from the Cooper hijacking. But the discovery raised more questions than answers. Only $5,800 was recovered. The remaining $194,000 was still missing. No one could explain how the money ended up buried along the riverbank. Had Cooper lost it during the jump? Did someone bury it later? Or was it placed there intentionally? The mystery deepened. Over the decades, investigators examined hundreds of suspects. Several names attracted serious attention. One of the most discussed was Richard McCoy, Jr., a Vietnam War veteran who hijacked another Boeing 727 just months later using a similar method. Another suspect was Kenneth Christensen, a former Northwest Airlines employee. He had knowledge of aircraft operations and lived near the suspected drop zone. A third theory pointed toward Lynn Doyle Cooper, whose family members believed he had confessed before his death. Each suspect seemed convincing at first, but every theory eventually collapsed. The evidence never reached certainty, and the identity of the hijacker remained unknown. For decades, the Federal Bureau of Investigation continued investigating the case. Thousands of suspects were examined. Fingerprints were analyzed. Witness statements reviewed. Evidence retested with modern forensic technology. Finally, in 2016, the FBI made an announcement. After 45 years of investigation, the agency officially closed the case. Resources would be redirected to newer investigations. The mystery of D.B. Cooper would remain unsolved. More than 50 years have passed since that flight left Portland. Some investigators believe Cooper died the night he jumped, lost somewhere in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. Others believe he survived, that he quietly returned to ordinary life, living under another name, perhaps watching the news as the story grew into legend. The truth remains hidden somewhere between those possibilities. A man boarded a plane, calm, polite, carrying a briefcase. He demanded a fortune, opened the rear stairs of a passenger jet, and stepped into the darkness, leaving behind one of the greatest mysteries in criminal history. So the question remains, did D.B. Cooper disappear into the wilderness? Or did he walk away from the perfect crime?